Can you accept the challenge to help make the lives of others better? How should you research your own thoughts? Which skills are needed to make a winning, reasonable argument? Should we embrace controversy and take a stand, as the founders of America did? Or is it easier to just walk away? We are pleased to explore all this and more with author, public speaker, and professor of journalism at the University of Texas and founder of Third Coast activist, Robert Jensen. You're watching Access News, Hands on News. Thank you for being here with us on Access News.
Great to be here, thank you.
Really intrigued by the title of your book, Arguing for Our Lives, Critical Thinking in Crisis Times. Can you explain why arguing for our lives seems to imply a matter of fact, life or death?
Well, I think there are two goals in the book. One is to recognize that arguing is more than just shouting at each other. People in the political realm or the media realm often see arguing in that degraded form. People just trying to score points, people trying to win. But argumentation in the classical sense is a process by which we deepen our understanding of the world. Now, I think that's particularly important today because we face multiple crises, obviously economic crises, political crises. People feel that democracy isn't functioning, and of course the really important ecological crises that really put at risk the long-term human presence on the planet. So this ability to argue in the constructive sense, to deepen our understanding of the world, has never been more important.
Before we can effectively argue for our lives, we need to first understand what critical thinking means, what that phrase means. And my definition is what you think of your own thoughts. Is that right? Wrong?
That's one way to talk about it. I try and situate critical thinking in this modern era. So one of the first things that I think is important to recognize is we live in a propaganda society. By that I mean that the flood of advertising, marketing, public relations, both in the commercial world and the political world, is really designed to derail our ability to think critically. So situating it in the struggles we all have to face that propaganda society is, I think, really important. There are some traditional critical thinking skills about learning to evaluate evidence, learning to see the assumptions behind an argument, honing our skills, our logical skills to put evidence together in a reasonable way is very important. I also think at this moment in history, it's very important to realize critical thinking has to be applied not just to the policies that are being debated in the moment, but the actual systems within which those policies are being proposed. To step back and look, not only should we increase taxes or decrease taxes, but step back and say, is the entire system that we use to organize our economy functioning anymore? I think this is a moment in human history where we need to really step back and critique every fundamental system within which we live. And I think that's an important part of critical thinking today, to be able to see how systems operate and ask a simple question. Are the systems that have served us well in the past, perhaps, still capable of serving us in the present?
So you make it sound like it's a really easy thing to do, but why does it seem so hard to be effective doing that today?
It seems hard because it is hard. Never before have we had more information available to us, which is a wonderful thing, especially for people like me who are teachers, but that also presents its challenges. How do we, as one person, try to sort through this flood of information? When that information is coming from so many different sources and we can have access to those sources, how do we evaluate the credibility of these kinds of sources? This is a particular problem for those of us who work in journalism, of course, because journalists are, in some sense, supposed to be that gatekeeper. But journalists are facing their own crisis of critical thinking as the profession tries to understand how it is going to evaluate these competing sources of information and try to tell the truth to the public.
I have to say I can relate to that experience because now in this political season, I notice there's so much controversy between the Democrats and the Republicans, and sometimes more information is better for me, but sometimes I get overwhelmed with all of the information. Sometimes it's better to just really take a step back and kind of leave it to the other people. Do you think that that's a problem? That there are more people, that the other people are doing that critical thinking for them? Because I'll admit that often I don't do it.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that no one individual has the ability, the time, the energy to understand every relevant issue. That human beings always think collectively. Now, when we're involved in vibrant political movements, when we have associations with other people, that collective thinking through of questions is somewhat easier because we're in groups where we're talking together. I think part of the problem in contemporary society is people often don't have those kinds of political communities. And I don't just mean membership in a political party, but groups and associations, even just groups of friends where politics is the lifeblood of conversation. I hear from more and more people, not only my students, but older people, who say they yearn for a place where they can talk politics, and there are few spaces in the culture that allow that. So part of the problem is people are kind of going it alone often. They're trying to sort through this flood of information without a community to do it. And that's one of the things I think we have to understand is rebuilding politics is about rebuilding political communities, about political associations. So that's part of the problem. People are feeling very isolated. And in that situation, nobody can figure it out. Even university professors with lots of resources and time, we struggle to understand. And of course, there are more and more arenas in which that knowledge is crucial. It's not just enough to know about your little part of the world these days. To make sense of the political questions in front of us, we have to have some working knowledge of not only the political system, but the economic system and the natural world. The ecological issues we face now are so compelling that it's almost as if everybody has to have some rough familiarity with science as well. And people are struggling, and people often do feel overwhelmed for perfectly reasonable reasons.
Talking about people feeling isolated, what would be your advice to a young person who tries to enjoy the process, so to speak, of politics?
Well, the first thing I tell students who ask me, how do I get involved, is simply to go to the places where people are doing those things. On a university campus, for instance, there are a number of lectures, speakers, films. I always tell students, go to where people are talking and see what makes sense to you. Find the like-minded people with whom you can start this conversation. I also think it's not enough, though, just to educate oneself or engage in conversation. There are many, many places in this society where you can get involved. I always tell people to follow their passion. What animates you is the most important question. For instance, I work in groups that are concerned with the rights of immigrants, the rights of workers. Those are issues that I feel very strongly about. I have all sorts of places where I go. They may be nonprofit groups, they may be study groups, they may be political, more overtly political groups. But the thing that I think is so dangerous about contemporary culture is with all of the media, with all of the ways we can amuse ourselves by ourselves, essentially. You know, the computer, video games, movies, the television set. There are literally, 101 ways that you can tune out and do it in a way that's sort of pleasurable. So that's a kind of quick, easy pleasure to amuse oneself electronically in a sense. But I think the deeper pleasures of life come from, face-to-face human interaction with people who share your values and share your concerns about the world. And so I try not only to tell that to young people, to do it myself. It's where I've found, for lack of a better word, the most joy in life is in that kind of engagement with people who are struggling to make the world a better place.
You mentioned disconnecting from society a little bit because we have so much stimulation. I know that you've written a lot about pornography.
Yeah.
Is pornography one of those?
Yeah, graphic, sexually explicit media is one of those places where the culture can seduce us literally into checking out of face-to-face human interaction. And I've been studying that particular industry for more than 20 years now. And the really dramatic effects of people's habitual and often very self-destructive use of sexually explicit material is just one, and admittedly a somewhat provocative and graphic example of it. But I think that the lessons I take away from the contemporary pornography industry have helped me understand media culture more generally. One of the things I say I learned from my study of the pornography industry is that as a culture we are over-mediated, that so much of our experience of the world is mediated by, for the most part, a screen. I often ask young people to reflect on a simple question. How much of what you know about the world comes through a screen, through a computer, through a television, through a movie screen, through a personal electronic device? I think of my own child in very concrete terms, who's 20 years old. And I think most of what he knows about the world has come to him through a screen. And there are really dramatic implications to this. I think the place that we should be the most concerned is about our connection to this larger living world of which we are a part. I always ask parents, kind of as a joke, if you wanted to teach your child about nature, would you rather your child sit inside for a day watching documentaries on television about nature, or would you rather your child go out in the woods? Well, you're going to learn a lot from nature documentaries. Many of them are very educational and very well done. But our direct connection to that larger living world is important. And the more we are mediated, the less that direct connection. I think we suffer as a culture from that. And I've certainly seen in my own life, being 54 years old, seen the dramatic increase in how many moments of our lives are mediated instead of, in a sense, directly connected to other people and to that larger living world.
So obviously you have a view of pornography that it is not helpful, that it's self-destructive. So should the government censor it?
I come out of a feminist critique of pornography. In other words, the perspective I take on it says that the problem of pornography is in part the way it socializes men especially into a certain view of gender and sexuality and power and violence. And so the traditional means of direct government censorship of pornography, let's face it, have not been terribly effective. The feminist movement that's raised these questions, and the movement out of which I do my work, has suggested some creative ways to reformulate law, to bring the problem of pornography and the related questions of violence, instead of in a criminal context, to bring them into a civil rights context. It's a complex argument, and I don't think there are simple answers. As someone who's made his living his entire adult life as either a journalist or a professor, I'm very, very careful about ever advocating any kind of government action to restrain communication. My life has been a life lived literally in the First Amendment and freedom of expression. So I'm skeptical and cautious about government interventions, but I do think that to not intervene in a recognizable social problem also has consequences. And I think we have to have a deeper public conversation about the balancing of the harms which come out of a pornography industry and the concerns about civil liberties.
You just mentioned being a feminist, so that makes you a male feminist. What do you think about that title? Are you proud of it?
Well, yeah, I was raised in a culture defined by male dominance, socialized like most boys and young men into that culture. And I was fortunate when I was able to go back to graduate school to encounter feminist writing and feminist activists and feminist professors. And what I realized is that most of my life, feminism had been presented to me as a threat. And I think that's how most men experience feminism. Feminists are these dangerous women who are going to do something to you and it's probably not very good. But what I realized is feminism is actually a gift to men. That men are often, and I certainly was raised this way, are trapped within what are often very toxic norms around masculinity, the way to be a man. which are not very fulfilling and often very self-destructive. So for me, the turn in my own life was to recognize that feminism wasn't going to take something away from me. Feminism had a lot to give to me. And it's been a really enriching part of my life, intellectually and personally. It's helped me rethink how the world works, and it's helped me also change the way I live, and in my opinion, both for the better.
I know you've seen a lot recently in the media about the war on women, a lot between the Democrats and the Republicans going on right now. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as someone who's been schooled in a feminist approach to understanding these questions, the first thing I do is step back and recognize that we do live in a society defined by male dominance. The old-fashioned word is patriarchy. And in patriarchal societies, men and traditional power tries to control women. Now, that happens in very different ways in very different societies. You can see across the world today very different ways of controlling women. But I do think that, for instance, control over women's bodies is central to male dominance. And allowing women to control their own bodies is crucial. Now, for me, that means support for reproductive rights, but it also means a critique of the pornography industry, for instance. I don't see these two things as separate. I see them very connected. That what we're really trying to create...
How so?
Well, in male-dominant societies, men take it as their right to use women in different kinds of ways. Now, conservative men and liberal men sometimes have very different ideas about this, but as a feminist or someone schooled in feminist theory, my inclination is to step back and not see liberal and conservative men as always arguing from opposite sides, but in a sense arguing flip sides of the same coin about access to women, control of women. And really the fundamental goal is autonomy for women. And I think there are some public policies at this moment that are crucial. And I think reproductive rights are one of them. I think there are some really serious and complex moral questions, for instance, about abortion. I don't minimize the depth of that struggle, but I do think that women's control of their bodies is, to me, a non-negotiable question. That is something that's essential if we're going to create a society that we really claim to want to create, that is one based on real notions of equality.
I'd like to talk a little bit more now about your profession as a journalist. What is good journalism? And is good journalism a dying profession?
Well, journalism is seriously facing a crisis in its business model. The way that journalism supported itself for years, advertising, underwriting the business of journalism, that whole model is in free fall, and the industry is, desperately trying to retool and find new revenue streams and new ways to organize on the business side. That's a challenge. I have some confidence that new forms of organization will emerge. But I think the central role of journalism remains the same. In a complex modern society that claims to be democratic, journalism has a very distinct role to provide a critical and independent source of information. And those two terms, critical and independent, are crucial. First of all, we should recognize this is, as we said earlier, this is a society awash in information. Corporations are constantly giving us information. The government provides information. But we're appropriately skeptical of information that comes from those sources because the people providing us that information have an interest in us believing a certain story. So journalism's claim to special status has always been based on its ability to provide an independent account of reality. Now, my own view is that that independent account also always has to be critical. By critical, I don't mean always running people down or always being negative, but able to step back and ask those critical questions about how wealth and power are distributed. And those are really the core issues. In a society striving to be as democratic as possible, we're always asking questions about how wealth and power are distributed. Concentrations of wealth and power are antithetical to democracy. And we're seeing this play out right now in a very, very dramatic way because concentrations of wealth in the United States today, and the United States is becoming a dramatically more unequal society in the distribution of wealth, are having an effect on politics. there's a crucial debate going on about the status of that concentrated wealth in the political arena. Should wealthy individuals and corporations be able to spend freely to affect the political process? One argument is, well, that's their right. It's freedom of expression at stake. The countervailing argument is that concentrated wealth skews the debate and essentially pushes out ordinary people who don't have access to that kind of wealth. And I think that's probably one of the most important political questions of the moment, is how are we going to treat money in politics? Right now, the forces that want to allow wealth, concentrated wealth, to dominate our political sphere, I think are winning. I think there's the beginnings of a pushback against that. My own hope is that there will be a stronger public movement to critique that position. But we're really just at the beginning of that debate, I think.
I know that your politics tend to be radical, but although your approach to some issues are more cautious, do you consider yourself controversial?
No, I think I'm just a very, well-intentioned, simple-minded professor doing his best. But I don't shy away from the word radical, and I always remember that the root, or the original meaning of that word from the Latin, is to go to the root. So in some sense, one view of what it means to be radical is to always be looking at root causes, at the basic nature of the systems that structure our world. And I think that's healthy.
Fundamental, right?
Right, back to the fundamentals, and not being afraid to critique the assumptions that are taken for granted in a culture. In that sense, I'm proudly radical. Sometimes that means I'm as critical of the Democratic Party as the Republican Party. It doesn't mean I'm on one particular side of any political debate. It means that I'm trying to be consistent in my critique of power, and I think that's very important. On the other hand, as you point out, I also have a kind of cautious side. I try not to make claims that I can't support with evidence. And in politics, of course, we're always tempted to go a little further, to make the point a little stronger than perhaps the evidence suggests. And I think that's the part of my nature that comes out of academic life, which is about being careful and very systematic in our thinking. So there's a political side and an intellectual side that come together in me, and I often find those two sides at war, but that's what we try and reconcile.
In the last few minutes that we have left, I'd love to ask you a little bit more about, you say you're not a fan of hope, meaning a feeling of expectation and desire for particular outcomes. Can you explain that?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about hope over the last 4 years. And of course, in some sense, the capacity for hope is part of being human. I don't know anyone who can get up in the morning and not in some sense have hope. But I want to be cautious about a kind of naive hope. I often say it's good to remember that there are sometimes problems without solutions. That is, problems that can't be solved within the framework that we take for granted. We go back to the ecological crisis, for instance. There are some problems that we often call environmental problems that I don't think have solutions, if by solution we mean a solution that will allow us to continue to live the way we do, using lots of energy and consuming lots of material resources. In that sense, the problems that we face in the environmental arena, I don't think have solutions, if by solutions we mean keeping this system going. I think we have to think much more radically about refashioning the way we live as human beings on this planet. So in that sense, I don't have any hope for the existing system. I do have hope that human beings can transcend these existing systems and create something new. But again, I'm also cautious. I don't want to make claims that I don't feel I can support. And I think that's important. Realistic expectations are important because that guides the experiments we go into. And I think that's an important recognition, that the next few decades for me are going to be decades of experimentation. In a lot of ways, I think the existing political, economic, and cultural systems are broken perhaps beyond repair. We've got to experiment and create new ways to be human beings that can be decent to each other in human communities and be in some sustainable relationship with this larger living world.
Do you have hope?
I think as long as one can hold on to a sense of joy in the world and not be afraid of the grief that's inevitable in this world, I think there's always reasons to be hopeful. And in that sense, yes, every day I wake up, I try to balance that joy and that grief and make it to the end of the day.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. I really enjoyed talking with you today. You can learn more about the work of Robert by visiting the University of Texas website and at our website, accessnews.us, where you can ask questions, share comments and opinions. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. One beautiful thing about America is that we, the people, have power. The more we know, the better decisions we make. For Access News, I'm Tamara, and that's Austin. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Created, written, and executive produced by Devorah Ben-Moshe and Ken Hurley. Hosted by Tamara Suiter-Ocuto. Interpreter for Tamara Suiter-Ocuto, Jennifer Stoker. Special thanks to Texas School for the Deaf. Funding provided by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. Supported by Austin Community Foundation. Production by Austin Community College. Civication Incorporated, www.civication.org.